The SQL language was developed back in the 70s, so it's been around for a long time, and it's been the standard for communicating with databases. It's powerful, easy to learn, and in this nugget, we're going to take a look at what it's all about. The structured query language, or SQL, or as I like to call it, SQL, can be broken down into three distinct subsets. We have commands for working with data. This subset is known as DML, the data manipulation language. It contains the select, insert, update, and delete statements. These are all used strictly for working with data. We also have commands for what's known as DDL, the data definition language. These are for working with database objects, create, alter, and drop. And finally, we have DCL, which is the data control language. This contains a subset of commands for doing things like granting permissions and controlling permissions on those database objects. Think of it like this. DCL, the data control language, is primarily used by DBAs, database administrators, to control security and access to database objects. DDL is primarily used by developers who create database objects, and DML, the data manipulation language, is, well, used pretty much by everyone, but more specifically, data analysts who write queries that target data. Let's start with a look at the most common part of this language, the one that is used every single day, the data manipulation language, DML. We have four statements here: select, insert, update, and delete. The select statement is used to read data, easily the most popular statement in all of SQL. The syntax goes something like this: select. We always start it off with select. Then we follow that up with a list of columns that we want to pull from a table. Then the from clause is used to target whatever table we're pulling those columns out of, and that's really the core of the select statement. Select columns from table. But we also can add where clauses onto it. This acts as a filter, so we can pull out specific records from a table. Now, it gets a little more complicated when you want to write a query that targets multiple related tables. Here we add in the join clause, where we join tables together on a common column. Then in our select list, we append the table name to the column name. That way we can distinguish which tables we're pulling columns out of. Next up, we have the insert statement, which is used to add data into a table. The syntax goes something like this: insert table name, then we specify our column list. These are the columns that we wish to add data into. Then we use the values keyword and put in the values that we're inserting, and they must be in the same sequence as our column list in the insert statement. Next up is the update statement. This is used to modify existing data in a table. The syntax is pretty straightforward. Update table name, set column equals value, comma, column equals value, so on and so forth. So you can specify which columns you want to update with new values, and then it's always a good idea to have a where clause in your update statement. That way you only target specific rows. If you don't have a where clause, then you'll update every single record in a table. And believe me, I've seen many junior DBAs make that mistake and get in trouble for it, and then never make it again, because that will require another DBA, most likely a senior level DBA, to perform a database restore to get all that data back. Last but not least, we have the delete statement, used to remove data from a table. This is the simplest as far as syntax goes, but also the most dangerous, because deleting data is just one of those things we need to be wary of. The syntax goes something like this: delete from table name, where, and then your where clause, otherwise known as your condition. Again, you always want a where clause here, so you only target the rows that you actually intend to delete. Moving on to DDL, the data definition language. We have three statements here. Create is used to create any database object you can think of. Tables, views, indexes, stored procedure, any single database object that exists, we create in SQL using the create statement. Next up, we have the alter statement, which is used to modify an existing database object. So let's say you created a stored procedure and loaded it up with a bunch of SQL code, and now you need to modify that code. Well, rather than do a create procedure, you would do an alter procedure and then place inside of that block your modified SQL code, and once you execute it, it'll save those changes. And finally, very much like we have the delete statement for DML, the drop statement in DDL deletes a database object. Last but not least, we have DCL, the data control language, which is again used by database administrators to give other members of our IT team access to run all of these statements and to access database objects within our database. The grant statement here is used to give a member or a user access to a database object or access to run one of these commands against a database object. Revoke does the opposite. It removes the permissions that were already granted to a user, and deny outright prohibits a user from accessing a database object and overrides anything that was granted. And that, my friend, is the SQL language in a nutshell. Master these commands, and you will be a SQL ninja. In this CBT Nugget, we broke down the structured query language by looking at all three subsets: DML, DDL, and DCL. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.